That spark of innovation, it's just waiting for the perfect combination of tools and talent to bring it to life. Welcome to Pitch, Build, Scale. I'm your host, Chris Fanchi, a recovering startup founder, veteran SaaS marketer, turned dev tech enthusiast and growth specialist. Each episode, we connect with the builders, the visionaries, and the problem solvers who are redefining what's possible with today's technology and pioneering the websites, apps, and software products of tomorrow. These are the conversations that transform how we build, how we sell, and how we scale technology businesses in a world where the tech evolves by the minute. Ready to stay ahead of the curve? This is Pitch, Build, Scale.
Hello and welcome to today's episode. We have a very exciting guest. For those of you just joining the podcast, we are Big North Marketing and specialize in helping dev shops and SaaS companies scale their revenue. So if you want to learn how to take your SaaS or dev business to the next level, make sure to stick around. And if you're interested in a free growth consultation, just drop us the word growth in the DMs. We are really excited to have today's guest, Guillermo Fernandes. Guillermo is a serial entrepreneur and former founder and CEO of Blockpliance, a crypto compliance and blockchain intelligence company that used AI to detect and prevent financial crime. After growing the business into a category leader, Guillermo led it through a successful acquisition in 2025. Before that, he built a career in international private banking, helped launch the first U.S. COVID-19 tracking app, and co-founded ventures across fintech, art, and startup marketplaces. Now, Guillermo is advising founders, exploring what's next, and sharing hard-won lessons from building at the intersection of finance, compliance, and AI. Guillermo, welcome to Pitch, Build, Scale.
Thank you very much, Chris. Excited to be here with you.
So let's start at the beginning. You went from international private banking into building a blockchain compliance company. What led to that leap?
Well, the experience moving money around the world is what led to it. I had started to use Bitcoin personally on 2012, and then I started my banking career. So I'm actually Bitcoin first, banking second kind of person. But I spent almost a decade moving money for wealthy people around the world, primarily from jurisdictions that are a little bit more complicated than the US. So Latin America, specifically Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina. And the one thing in common those countries have is that the local currencies tend to fluctuate in price. And every 5 to 10 years, there's some crisis that forces a lot of capital flight out of the country. So everyone there wants to have their money safe in the United States. The problem is that some of the capital restrictions and regulations don't allow them to take money out of the country, don't allow them to take up to a certain amount. So the easy fix, based on my experience, was to move money from local currency into magical internet money, call it Bitcoin. And once it was in Bitcoin, it was very easy to be sent to the United States and unwound into dollars, and they're sent to the bank. So we started to do that. And once we achieved scale, compliance or lawyers and the regulators didn't quite love it, this being, 16, 17. So understanding that friction between the banking world and the crypto world, and contrary to popular belief, it had nothing to do with banks not wanting to accept crypto. It had everything to do with the risk of doing it without proper compliance and proper regulatory oversight. So once that became abundantly clear, and I had achieved personal milestones in my banking career, it sort of became evident to me that the next thing had to be to unlock or solve for this specific issue on the compliance of the crypto side, so institutions around the world could actually bankerize those funds.
So what was your background when you were going into finance initially and then making that transition? Did you have a business background? Did you have a technical background?
So I come from an entrepreneurial family, that definitely not highly technical whatsoever, but primarily business. I started doing, soft work with the family and family businesses since I was like 14. And I would spend my summers and the winter breaks stuck at the shop and just helping parents or grandparents with their business. So I think that's how I learned everything I had to about businesses. And then I studied economic and finance. did some internships in Wall Street, specifically for investment banking in New York. And shortly after that, took over a family business that was not doing great. So it was time to be restructured. And as life and fate would have it, I ended up going through that process for 3 years by myself and saving business. So very early in my career, I had to face things that most businesses avoid having to face throughout their journey. So that taught me about being very lean with a team, being very lean with expenses, and about how complicated and difficult things can get if they're not handled properly. And I think that I sort of carried over that into my banking profession and then as an entrepreneur as well, which seems to have helped me quite a bit.
So, what got you interested in Bitcoin at such a young age? Was that something that you discovered during school, or was it some outside influence?
Yeah, the interest was, to be frank, not in Bitcoin itself. So at the beginning, the interest was in solving a problem. The first time I ever heard about Bitcoin was from an Asian neighbor in this big building I used to live in right in front of MIT. MIT being obviously one of the top schools in the world where a lot of people that are heavily technical exist. I guess that, Bitcoin was part of the common narrative there back in 2011 and 12. It was definitely not in my world. But this neighbor, which we would run into each other quite frequently in the lobby and in the hallway of the building, he had this like internal joke about you Venezuelans and your Bitcoin, and I swear to God, had no idea what that meant. As a matter of fact, I just thought he was referring to like some drug or something. So one day, I guess, so some days you're feeling the joke, some days you're not. One day I was just like not feeling it, and I stopped him. I'm like, dude, like, what have you been saying? Like, what's his Bitcoin stuff? Like, because in my mind, he had constructed this association between Venezuela and Bitcoin. And I quite honestly had no idea what it was. So he tells me that these forums online where Bitcoin is discussed and traded and people buy it and sell it is filled with Venezuelans and Argentinians trying to like, get as much Bitcoin as they can because they use it to move the money outside. And that resonated immensely because I had that issue. So I remember taking the elevator up, going on my computer and typing on Google, like, what is Bitcoin question? And that was sort of the beginning of the story.
So, how did clients react to you bringing Bitcoin as an option for them getting out of their countries? Was it something they had considered already, or was it a novel idea to them at that point?
So most of the clients that we had in the international banking side were primarily in their late 50s, early 60s, male entrepreneurs. That's like the perfect fit for who was our client. So tech savviness was not at the forefront of the description. So we had to help a lot, but there was a challenge. And the main challenge was that as a licensed FINRA broker and banker, we couldn't hold nor perform some of these operations. So it was very much a conversation where I would say, hey, this is what I've been using for a few years. It works wonders. It solves this issue and it's not illegal, but you got to sort of figure it out on your own.
So, did you run into more issues from a legal standpoint with American regulators or with the overseas governments?
No, overseas, we never had an issue. Overseas, we never had a single issue. The American regulators, honestly, it started internally. So it started in the institution itself of all banks do like bank account reviews. And depending on how much money you move and the velocity and the risk profile, that review happens once every sort of 6 months or once a year or once every 2 years. They like to say it's once a quarter. I've never seen it that way, at least not in the smaller institutions, right? Large institutions do have automatic risk assessments based on technology and AI, but smaller institutions don't. So it took a while for these efforts to start compounding into the internal team noticing that a significant portion of the money exchange between currencies had migrated out of exactly what they knew, which was the black market, which by the way, it's illegal. Like that is why it's called the black market. So you have a black market for currency in which currency gets traded between normally a peer-to-peer transaction. So we go into some office, like I visit your office, I come with a lot of cash, I give you the cash and you send me the wire. Like it sounds shady because it is, but it's how Morocco moves a lot of money. It's how Ecuador does it. It's how Venezuela does it. Argentina. There's a term actually in Brazil and Argentina for the person that sells you the dollars called doleiro, which is like your dollar guy. So even though that is illegal, the bank understood how it worked and tried to fake or prevent that they weren't seeing it. So it was very much a the three monkey thing, don't hear, don't see, don't tell kind of
Hmm.
argument. Once we stood out of that into using this magical internet money, the capital flow sort of broke on their head because the benefit to using Bitcoin at the time is that the money would originate from a transaction in your name and it would come into the bank or from an account in your name in Coinbase, for example. They sort of like couldn't reconcile how you had obtained those bitcoins and where those bitcoins were. So as soon as they started to, I had to also sell internally the idea that Bitcoin was good and all these things. But as soon as that sort of like started to become something that they had to understand and investigate, just by the poor timing of the situation, you would Google Bitcoin, and the first 10 things that would come up were FBI arrests Ross Ulbricht for Silk Road, FBI arrests Alexander Cáceres for Alphabet. Like basically the first 10 searches were some sort of news related to how it was used for illicit purposes.
Right.
So very quickly they started to like question the morality and the ethicality of it.
So what then spurred you to, obviously you're seeing your clients have these issues. You're having issues trying to deal with this yourself. So I assume this is the inspiration for building your own company off of it. How did you go about solving that problem?
Well, first, we should say that not all the money that we moved was in Bitcoin. The overwhelming majority was just in transactions in United States dollars and the regular capital flows and black market dynamics that the bank was used to. Some of the sophisticated clients that also happened to be maybe some of the ones that moved a little bit more money were the ones that would use something like this. What inspired me to do it, and there was a big lead time between me noticing this issue and actually being convinced that it was an issue that was worth solving and that I could solve it, was that how difficult it was to take out of the mold that Bitcoin was a scam to the traditional financial system, guys. Like I would speak to peers of mine who were bankers for Goldman Sachs and for JP Morgan and for Merrill Lynch or Citi Private. Miami, it's not like a huge banking hub. So basically, if you're a banker in Miami, you sort of like know the other 100 people that do it at certain level, at least. So everybody was starting to have pushback on this. At the time, Jamie Dimon had said that Bitcoin was a scam and they had actually prohibited all of the JP Morgan and Chase debit cards and credit cards from being used in anything that was considered a virtual currency service provider. So Bank of America followed that. So I thought, like, I personally got some accounts closed at these institutions, presumably just because I had interacted with this technology. But at the same time, every time I saw the count on users in Bitcoin Talk and friends that were launching things in the area, just having more and more and more retail adoption. So I like to say that for the first time in the financial services world, the digital assets were retail forward instead of coming from the top down. Like most of the innovation that we see, credit cards, debit cards, online banking, are pushed by the financial institutions into their clients. And normally the clients that get access to a lot of these things first are the wealthy clients. So you want to invest structured equities or structured products. Do you want to invest in hedge funds, in private equity, like this type of stuff? It starts with the family offices of the world, and then it goes to the high net worth individuals. And then eventually, at some point, normal people have access to put some money into it. For the
Mhm.
first time ever, I saw the opposite happening. the banks didn't want to push this to their clients, but the retail client, your normal debit card pro user, was the one actually pushing for the technology to be adopted. So it just there's many more of those that there are of the family offices and the high net worth individuals. So it just made sense that this effort was going to compound. Also, my career had grown to a point where I had started a book of business for managing people's money about 7 years prior to this, or 6 years prior to this. And it had grown to be a significant portion of the unit of that the bank had. And I just didn't see myself, quite frankly, being a forever private banker.
Mm,
So it just seemed like a natural transition that I wanted to do something else. At the time is when we did the COVID-19 tracking with some other volunteers. And that sort of proved to me that, actually technology wasn't that difficult and how easy it was, quote unquote, to
mm.
build something that people wanted to use. We just, we picked the right problem at the right time. So we saw a lot of virality associated with it. Blockpliance was a little different because it didn't sell directly to consumers; it sold to enterprises. But it still was, it still was like something that I could build on.
So, what have you seen in terms of the attitudes towards cryptocurrency in the finance markets? Do you feel like it's reached a tipping point yet that it's widely accepted by those working in finance, or is there still some hesitation or pushback there?
It's a great question because I have mixed feelings about it. Definitely, when you say the word Bitcoin, it's not a bad word anymore. Okay. And I keep focusing on Bitcoin just because Bitcoin is what most people accept. So, you could also use other cryptocurrencies, but sort of like the deeper you go into the rabbit hole, the less likely it is that it becomes mainstream. Most traditional finance and lawyers and accountants, regulators are like not as kind to other currencies, but they'll understand Bitcoin. From a legal standpoint, it's very well separated from securities. So there's like no risk on that sense. Having said that, I think people in the industry understand there's a space and there's demand for this, and it's starting to be considered a more common domain. But how many Fortune, 100 companies actually have Bitcoin on their books? So the narrative is common, but the implementation doesn't seem to be yet. I think we will get there. So the United States, it's currently working on a framework for stable coins. We shall see that regulation coming up for debate, hopefully within the next 4 months or so. Once that gets approved, I think it's going to open the doors for a lot of the financial institutions and large corporations to be able to confidently use stable coins, very likely primarily Circle USDC, because it's US based and they financed a lot of the rule making or the regulatory making. So normally, you finance those things because you get a benefit out of it. So as soon as we see that the migration from stablecoin to other types of cryptocurrencies should be smoother because it does provide confidence and enhanced security. And the rails for institutions to do the custody of this have to, are the same. Like custodying USDC, it's primarily or very much the same technology rails as custodying your Bitcoin or your Ethereum or your Solana.
So let's talk a little bit more about Blockpliance specifically. So, how did you go about solving the problem? What did you see as the problem, and what was your solution? And then how did you build that yourself?
So the first prototype I built myself, it's soft. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of building a prototype, even if it doesn't work exactly as you want it to do. So based on my experience, I had drafted what I thought people wanted to look at. And with that thinking and a little bit of product discovery, I followed the guidance from a book. I don't remember the name of the author, but it's called The Mom Test. It's a short book. It's 80 something pages. It's available actually for free online. That's how I found it. But it basically tells you about how you should ask your users questions to investigate your product without like leading them on. The premise is basically your mom's never gonna tell you your product sucks. So you should never ask things like, oh, hi mom, like look at this beautiful thing I created, because you're not gonna get the responses that you should get. So
Mm.
that framework, I read the book, used the framework, conducted about 100 interviews with prospective users from my network. So I went back to the lawyers and the compliance and the risk people and some of the other bankers just to understand basically what would make them feel comfortable with this.
Were you
And a
still
lot of what
working in banking at this time?
no, I was not. I had actually left the bank. It was a long process. It took like a year for me to leave the bank. We had to replace obviously who was going to lead the book and all these things. So based on that process, I just started setting up time with the people that I needed to ask the question, what would make you feel comfortable in accepting this? How could we actually move forward with this? Or what would you need to see? And something that kept coming up was that people wanted to have sort of like a Google that they could understand who was behind the money, because that was it was all about. In a world where technically these things are anonymous, they wanted to break within reason some of that anonymity and just understand that it was somebody good. So if the money had been one step prior to being in our client's hands at a darknet marketplace, that was probably not something we should be accepting. And that remains the case, by the way. Like if you're directly connected to money that has been in child pornography, terrorist financing, or any type of marketplace like this, the darknet marketplaces, exchanges are very likely going to flag that account. So the technical challenge, or the first technical challenge that we had to optimize for, was how do we do that? Because the one thing that it's clear, and I didn't invent this, it existed for many years prior to me even starting this, was you could use a block explorer, which is a piece of software, it's normally a website, although you can have one locally, that basically indexes, creates an Excel sheet, basically a fancy way of saying it, of everything that's happening in the blockchain, and you can sort of navigate it. So if the blockchain is a chain of blocks, you can follow that chain and sort of like pull back on it and
Okay.
understand like what happened before in each block. And the blocks inside of them, they have a list of all of the transactions. So the one thing that I did is that I grabbed a public piece of software that at the time was called blockchain.info, and I built a replacer, a text replacement, for every time that you saw an account number called a wallet that I knew who was owned by, it would replace the long, 30-digit number for that name. So if we knew your account was 12345, every time 12345 showed up, instead of saying 12345, it would say, Chris Fancher. That was the first prototype. And very quickly, I had to hire a team to help me actually like productize this, and the rest is history.
So when did Blockpliance go live? When did it hit the market?
The market in February of 2022.
So how were things going? What was your reaction when the FTX scandal hit? Did that have an impact on you?
Did, but not directly on us. It did more on the market, which impacted our sales. The most difficult problem that we had to optimize for in Block Clients was sales. Not because people don't want it, the product, but because we were selling to institutions. Institutions make decisions based on years in the future. So it's never really about what's happening today. It's more about by the time we implement this, which can take them 6 months or a year, where will the company be? Where will the industry be? Selling to banks became increasingly more difficult once FTX and Three Arrows and like all of these, there was a period of time of like 2 months where basically the market really collapsed based on scandals and scams. That is very similar to the situation the market had been when the original set of darknet markets started. It's great for awareness of crypto and like people be aware that it exists. And it's great for adoption, but it's not great for the looks of it. So we had to sort of like re-architect and go back through that cycle. So it affected a lot of our sales with financial institutions. But on the contrary, it made our sales with intelligence and government units and regulators slightly easier. So what we had to do is that we had to sort of pivot all of our efforts from the private side into the public side because it's where demand was really going. And that also happened around the same time that El Salvador had nationalized Bitcoin as a official legal tender. So because we had significant operations offshore, primarily in Latin America, we had to double down into our Latin American sales to make sure that we survive.
So how did you land your first few customers, given all these barriers and the institutional hesitation, let's say, around cryptocurrency? How did you get the first ones to say, all right, let's give it a try?
The first few customers did it basically as a favor to me. There's no like polite way to say it. It was like I'm calling Chris to ask for a favor, and Chris knows that my trajectory was as a very good private banker and somebody serious. I never had any issues with any money movements, and every single case that we had, we always had very strong KYC, know your customer, know your client. So in them understanding or putting a lot of weight in my professional background, it de-risked a little bit of the, hey, please use this thing and let me know your feedback. But I think it took about 6 or 7 months before we had our first paid customer. The first 5 or 6 customers were all free.
Mm. Yeah, having those brand names and logos to put on your marketing materials when you're going to future customers is a big deal.
Yeah, we also did. We got lucky that we got accepted into a program called the Mass Challenge. It's like a startup program out of Massachusetts, out of Boston, and a lot of the money behind that program comes from Mass Mutual and some other big name brands, NASA, IBM, State Street Bank, like some of the big names. So because we did that program, we sparked interest on State Street, which I'm not sure if the audience will be familiar with because it's not a bank you can just walk into as a client. They're normally a bank of banks and a bank of mutual funds. So they're basically a bank for institutions. We sparked their interest because they were considering launching a digital asset unit to do custody of Bitcoin for a future ETF or mutual fund or something like this. But again, remember, this industry moves slow, so you need to have the rails before. So we were very early in that journey. So they became, or that unit became our first like flagship user. And like once you have something like State Street on your pitch, people start to pay more attention. Like
Yeah.
there's like there's something there that it didn't matter that we had like 6 other clients that were very small financial institutions or police units or nobody cared. We put State Street there and out of the sudden it's like we're having people reach out. So it was really that different.
So what role did storytelling or education play in your go-to-market strategy, being able to get those customers to buy in to what you were doing?
That's a great question. I think that that's something that we could have done better. A lot of the story was just built on the momentum and the need for this technology. But I think that for a very long time, we lacked like an intrinsic success story of why we made sense. The technology made sense. And there were actually other companies doing it as well, way bigger than us. There's this company that had raised $500 million, was valued at 9 billion. So, like we were very much like a startup in a world where there were like 4 or 5 other startups that were huge. And we were sort of like borrowing from their success to tell our story. That was a mistake. And it took us a while to realize we had to have our own success. We needed our own reason for existence. The fact that the industry was there didn't mean that we needed to exist. We really only hacked it when we started doing the very esoteric stuff. Like when we started to go into the dark web and fight directly and interact and do everything to discover who ran marketplaces that did or sold drugs or who ran the child pornography sites or the torture chambers. Like once we got into like the very, very dark side of that industry, which is something that, by the way, none of these competitors do because of risk. That's when we started to find our story of like, we need to exist because we have outperformed and outpaced these competitors in this one thing, which is where the real bad money is. So, like, yeah, money that, somebody bought some like marijuana with Bitcoin, that's whatever, very different attitude from this client is bringing money that was transacted on a torture chamber 2 transactions ago.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very different. And obviously that's gonna get government's attention for sure.
Correct. And the government, by the way, which is something that people often don't even think about. The government has to do some of these investigations themselves. But for them to get approval to use taxpayers' funds to like send to a terrorist in Middle East, it's very difficult. And it's kind of counterintuitive because it is in the taxpayers' best interest that the government knows who that wallet is owned by in the Middle East who's a terrorist. So we can make sure to block that and prevent it and launch an investigation. So normally the way a lot of these things are done, it's through contractors and third-party companies that can make risk-based decisions and sort of like shorten the time to investigation as long as we follow certain guidelines, right? And they're very strict, they're very strict about things you can and things you cannot.
Right. So how do you balance the privacy side of things? Obviously, crypto and Bitcoin in particular are often framed as a way to privately transact, a way to not have the government looking over your shoulder on every transaction. So you're kind of piercing that veil a little bit with your technology. So how do you square that?
Well, privacy and anonymity are two different things. So I'm all in and I'm a sucker for privacy. I run local networks. All of my devices are secure. I've spent a stupid amount of time making sure that I can be private with some things. Even my personal life. We have obviously a public persona. I am the face of the company, but like my personal life, it's private. Anonymous is a different story. I am of the belief that we should be supporters of human rights and of the human right to privacy. But once you break the law, especially if it directly interacts or affects other humans, so crimes against humanity, and that includes terrorism, that includes child pornography, human trafficking, any perpetrator of any of those crimes is forfeiting the right to human rights. So, by all means, a little bit of the mentality that is being applied in El Salvador, where people complain that there's a jail called El Secot, that it's very tough on crime and on criminals.
Mhm.
Well, but should we really put people inside that compound higher on a human rights scale than people that are outside of the compound, normal civilians that are going about their life? My answer is no. I think that you have to care for your non criminal population first. And what that means in the blockchain world is that we really never really cared about like what you or your mom or your like family member are doing on the blockchain. We just cared about understanding if that was good or bad. We would not spend any sort of effort in trying to figure out if the account was owned by you or by your wife or by your boss or whatever it is. Unless that account had shown up in a child pornography material website. At that moment, we dedicated all of our efforts into making sure we could know as much as we could from you. So hopefully, we could find out exactly who owned or the IP or something that would link it to a person. And we could inform authorities, hey, we have this chain of information and we believe it is linked to this person. The authorities could make sure you were not like the principal at a school. So that's why I say like we had to draw and we didn't make a lot of friends, to be very honest on this. There are threats on some forums, most of them on the dark web, about why companies like us are bad and evil and shouldn't exist and why people should hack us. And even though at the beginning it was a bit scary, like I became increasingly more aware of the fact that when you try to do good, unfortunately, people who are in the other side of that coin have financial means and motivation to make sure that you can't be a roadblock on their journey.
Hmm.
So yeah, so that's ultimately how we crafted also like our own story. Our story was we are in a position where we've understood this really crazy sides of the world. I would go to Mexico, I would go to Venezuela, I would go to Brazil and would physically go into the favelas to understand how the gangs and the favelas were using this technology. So we have a lot of data that it's not something you can just pick up from being sitting in your computer in New York or San Francisco.
Mm. Very
So that
interesting.
that was like our main unlock.
Very interesting. So let's jump to the acquisition side as we're closing out the episode here. Tell us a little bit about you've got some buy-in from governments now. You've got some buy-in from State Street, which is opening doors for you. It's time to scale up and then exit out. So walk us through that journey.
Turns out that scaling AI products it's very expensive. And we had to compete for computing power in AI right at the same time as ChatGPT's like becoming the big thing. So compute becomes very expensive. We had not raised venture capital money for Blockpliance. We had primarily bootstrapped it with two angel investors as well. So the thing that was hammering our growth and our ability to launch new products and add more currencies to what we wanted to investigate, because we were primarily Bitcoin first or Bitcoin only at the beginning, was really our ability to pay for more compute power. Give IBM and Amazon a couple $100,000 a month just for just for their computer. So we needed, without any doubt, we needed to raise venture money. The problem is that there's like a lead time on this, and there's a focus cost to doing the venture money as well, because it takes you 2 to 3 months in which primarily the CEO, who was me, has to be dedicated to raising the money while the team needs to continue doing sales and things. And we were a small team, and the opportunity cost of that focus was very high. So around June of 2024, we make the decision to raise capital. We start the process. And in the first week, I had something like 40 something calls with VCs. Yeah, you try to box the process so it creates a little bit of fear of missing out, FOMO, because like all these VCs talk to each other. So the
Hmm.
best thing you can do is have 3 or 4 of them in the same week say, "Oh, I spoke to these companies. Oh, I spoke to them too. Oh, I spoke to them too," and you sort of have this moment where like we're all speaking to them, like who's gonna win the ticket, right? In those like 40 calls, I think I must have heard about 80% of the time the, "Wow, this is really cool. You guys have conquered like all this traction. This is amazing. How are you thinking about like the election cycle affecting your business?" And
Mm.
everybody that I would speak to had sort of the same aspect of, if the Biden regime stays, it means that Gary Gensler stays in the SEC, and Operation Chokepoint 2.0, which is an operation that the government launched against crypto at a banking scale. So they would close accounts for crypto companies, they would close accounts and like basically harass people that were tangent to the industry or in the industry. And you can read about this. It's on the it's like, if that prevailed, it meant that our business and our sales cycle was going to continue being a long one. VCs want to finance things that are growing, month over month in a double digit. They are less likely to finance things that have 1.5 years to close a business. Even if that business becomes huge in 10 years or 15 years, you will find some VCs that do that. The high conviction. or as I call them, the really good investors, the one that can think independently of the market dynamics and the FOMO. But you'll probably have to have 400 or 500 conversations with investors for you to find the 2 or 3 VCs that are willing to take that risk. So as we sat down and debriefed with the team about that week, it became evident that, well, we don't know who's going to win. And it's very much a Boolean binary thing. Either Biden wins and we're screwed because the industry is going to continue stagnant for the next 4 years. And we're going to have to rely primarily on our international sales, which, by the way, now that we're out of COVID and like meeting in person, it's what's the standard again. It becomes more expensive because then you have to do trips from New York or Santa Barbara, which is where the other where my co-founder was. Is each trip to Brazil only in the ticket costs you 1,200, and then you're staying there for a week. So next thing you know, your trip to go sail it's costing you 4,000 or $5,000. But
Hmm.
you have to do that several times. So basically, you're spending 100K a year or more just in travel. So we sat down and we said, hey, we should probably rekindle some of the interest that we had gotten inbound from people wanting to acquire us. So in 2022 and 2023 and early 2024, we got inbound of people saying, hey, if you're ever on the market, or how would you consider doing this? Or so we went back to the process. We figured that there was interest, and because it's a terrible idea to just sell to one candidate because then you never maximize your price. We run a process, full-fledged, self-ran, self-directed investment banking process. And that's the story. We ended up selecting a candidate for that position. It didn't pan out as we wanted it to be. So we went back to the process, which is crazy to think about. Basically, I've sold block clients 4 times. Went back to the process and realized that some of the other candidates were very interested in pieces of our business.
Mm.
But the one that acquired the brand and everything, which is a public Canadian company, the subsidiary of public Canadian company, called Blockchain Intelligence Group, they didn't need, for example, or transaction indexing code because they have their own. Like they have a product similar to Blockpliance, so we compete. The backend that they're using it's similar to ours. There's only so many ways you can query the nodes and index the transactions, and it's just what it is. So we end up doing this complex transaction in which we sell the company to this party, but we IP carve out. So we take like a little bit of our intellectual property and we are able to sell it to another company that needs that for stable coin stuff. And then we take out of attribution database that knowing who's who in the database, like in the world of crypto. And we had agreed very early in our journey that if we ever wanted to sell the company, we would give an option for a 3-letter agency to buy that database.
Mm.
So we had to.
Yeah. So were you at a point where your runway wasn't long enough to get you through the election to see how things turned out, or did you just decide it wasn't worth the risk to try to
Well,
wait it out?
that's a really funny that you asked because we ran out of money twice. Yeah, in the history of Block Plans, we ran out of money twice. Like literally no money, we can't pay you kind of a scenario. The two founders, Don and I, weren't really compensated by the company because it was primarily our own money. So, it didn't really make sense for us to sort of like put money and then pay ourselves. So the 2 times that we ran out of money at a personal level, I injected more capital into business. The problem is that the second time I ran out of money at a personal level too. So I ended up injecting also some loan money into it at a personal capacity. So we couldn't really let this happen a third time because because I could not borrow anymore. And that's why we ended up saying, okay, if we don't raise the venture capital money, or if we think this journey is going to take us too close to November, and then people are going to want to just stick it out and see what happens, we're not going to survive into the 2025 cycle that we need. So the safety precaution here to make sure we don't run out of money and don't have a capacity to finance it. It's really to explore the sale. So the sale really came as a product of very meticulous financial planning that we had to do, knowing that in startups you are in a competition against time, but time reflects itself on your bank account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. So before I let you go, I know we're going pretty long, but I think this has been a fascinating conversation. I love learning about this stuff. What is next for you?
I'm not sure. I've been taking some time. The privilege of exiting the company, and not the team went to work for some of these companies, but I decided to take a step back and just I'm going through my notes and my book and my journal and figuring out what we learned, what things should be done differently next time. And I'm not sure exactly what's next. Something will come, but what I am very positive is that whatever comes next, it comes with a little bit more experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Guillermo, this was a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing all your insights and your experiences. I think the audience will really enjoy this one. Can you tell people where they can find you, and if you want followers, want to have conversations, what you're looking for?
Yeah, I'm always happy to to connect on Twitter at Guille Fernandez, or on LinkedIn. Just look my name or look Blockpliance and you'll see it. We're connected. Yeah, happy to start conversations. A lot of people reach out just with questions on the crypto stuff. I think that's a good place.
Great. And thanks again to the audience for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and as always, keep pitching, keep building, and keep scaling. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Pitch, Build, Scale. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast provider so you never miss an episode, and we'll see you next time.